Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panelists today. Well, first, this is the welcome to the Closing the Racial Homeownership Gap forum here. And we're going to talk about some of the important issues about some of the inequities we see in housing here. Our panelist bios, we've got Jonathan Reckford here, who is the CEO of Habitat for Humanity since 2005. He helped lead the organization through a period of tremendous growth, both in the United States and globally. With decades of experience ranging from Wall Street to his local church, Jonathan has helped chart the path, taking Habitat from a place of serving 125,000 people a year to helping over 7 million people last year alone. Then we've got, and I'm just reading this in the order of what it's on here, not saying anyone is more important than the other. Then we've got Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck. Lieutenant Governor Heck serves as Washington's 17th Lieutenant Governor and brings a lifetime of experience in public, private, and nonprofit sectors. As Lieutenant Governor, he is the president of the Washington State Senate, serving as acting governor whenever Governor Inslee is out of state, and runs his own small agency whose legislative priorities include international relations, housing, and economic development. He also was previously elected to the first United States, he was previously elected to be the first United States representative to Washington's 10th Congressional District. Then we have Mayor Bruce Harrell. Born in Seattle to an African-American father who was one of the first Black union linemen at Seattle City Light, and a Japanese-American mother who had been incarcerated at Minidoka during World War II. Partly because of this history, Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell thinks a lot about the importance and effects of housing stability. Growing up in Seattle's red-lined Central District, Mayor Harrell has seen how zoning can impact a community. He was elected mayor of Seattle in 2021. And then Nicole Bascomb-Green. Nicole Bascomb-Green was born and raised in the Central District of Seattle. She's the head of community lending at Umpqua Bank, serves as the local board president of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, and is a core team member of the Black Home Initiative. She's also on the board of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. Her work focuses on the financial health and wellness of the Black community, particularly in housing. To start this conversation, which is about the racial homeownership gap, I'd like to start with Nicole and Mayor Harrell, because your lived experiences perhaps are the most relevant to this topic. Nicole, I'd like to start with you and just try to understand a little bit about the legacy of redlining as you may have experienced it as a kid growing up in the Central District. Can you start with?
Absolutely. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for having me, Habitat. It's a long story, but I'll make it, short and concise. Growing up, I didn't know that I was growing up in a redline community. I knew that my family lived there. Everyone was a homeowner that I knew. My friends were close. My family was close. But hearing conversations as an adult that I heard as a child, understanding that, for instance, my great aunt talking about going to see Mr. Man, is what she called him, and on Aurora, he was the only hard money lender that would lend to folks in the Black community. So they had to go to Aurora when we had banks in the community who wouldn't lend to help put a roof on the house or, support the property that we owned in the neighborhood. And when I was ready to buy a home at 24, I couldn't move into the Central District. I couldn't live where I had been born and raised and where I wanted to raise my family. And so I had to move out to the suburbs where I could afford it. And the more money I made, I thought, okay, I'll be able to get back to the city. But prices got more expensive than my income increase. So it's been very much a challenge to see the community change, go from the community I know to a community I don't even recognize anymore. And so the Central District is, there's a lot of folks who are working on trying to bring some of that back. I would like it to look like that from a homeownership perspective, but in reality, because of the topic we're talking about here, it is a challenge for Black folks to get back into the CD when the average home is $1 million for a 2-bedroom. So, the challenges are really widespread, but part of BHI, what I'm really excited about is that we are working on a systems change so that we can start to really evaluate how we can make these things happen in a realistic fashion where we haven't been able to do that in the past.
I know you talked about going, it was going to Mr. Man, you said, who was the lender. you've become kind of a lender yourself in a
Yes.
way.
Yes, I have.
I mean, were you driven by that past into this role? Does it drive you to this day?
You know, what got me into banking was my dad. My dad knew the regional manager for Washington Mutual, and I was 15 years old, and he was like, my daughter needs a job. And I started at Washington Mutual and never left. Because also in the banking world, I realized that it was always just me, or maybe me or someone else. The challenges I faced internally in banking, you know, not being able to rise to spaces where I felt like I deserved it. You know, the same tropes that other people have had. I'm training others to take over a role that really belongs to me. So it was important for me to stay in finance so that one, no one else would be coming behind and not see themselves, or not have someone able to sponsor them or be a mentor to them, because I never had any of those things. So it was important, and again, to that comment my aunt made, that there is no more Mr. Man from that perspective. They can go to the bank and see someone who looks like them that they can trust and know that they have their best interest at heart. So that's what kept me in this space from the banking perspective.
Mayor Harrell, I'm wondering if you can reflect on your past in the Central District goes even a little bit further back than that. I'm wondering, what's the first time you sort of realized the influence of that legacy of redlining in your family?
Yeah, there's so much to talk about in this forum, so I'll try not to use all my bullets here in the first question. There's so many exciting things that we're all trying to do together. And to piggyback on what Nicole said, first, I grew up with her family, and literally just houses away, and we went to the same schools. And I'm a little older than her, so her mom and dad and others. And I want to first say thank you for being here, because as we fight against racism and institutional practices and racist policies in the past, and we fight to have a diverse community, Black and brown communities, people who speak English as a second language, I see a lot of diversity in front of me. I also see white people. That's the Seattle I'm trying to build. But I truly believe we all care about this issue. It's not just people who are directly impacted. That's the beauty of Seattle, and I think that Seattle is very special in that point. And so to answer the question directly, my mother and father didn't go to college, and the first house they bought, it was for $6,000 right on 24th and Olive. And to put it in relative terms, my mother worked at the Facts newspaper, and my dad, as you described in the introduction, Joshua, was just a construction lineman for the city light. But we had a home and one bathroom, but I felt like we were living in a palace, you know, and my mother made sure we kept it clean like a palace, by the way. And no one forced us out of that house. And this is an important message as we start thinking about what's happening in our country, in our city. The house appreciated. And when I was in high school going to Garfield, it appreciated to $30,000. And so they sold it for a whopping $30,000, and then bought a house 3 houses away from Franklin High School for $50,000. And then that house appreciated to become hundreds of thousands of dollars in value. And unfortunately, my mother and father didn't live to see me become mayor while they were looking down at me. But that house kept appreciating. And I didn't really understand, as Nicole said, the concept of redlining. I just thought, if you read the Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, well, we have a tendency to move where property's cheap, jobs are plentiful. Even if you're skilled labor or even in a salaried position, we go where there's opportunity. And so part of my work, and I'll close on this one question, is part of my work is I always try to bring data on what we're trying to do here in the city of Seattle. I drive my executive team to, we have to convince the public that we're on the right track and that our values match our rhetoric. And so I have numbers at some point, some question will trigger these numbers. But my work, while I'm passionate about the 84 square miles in Seattle, and through great organizations like Habitat for Humanity and the organizations right in front of me, through great leadership and commitment, most of the people I grew up with now do live in Renton and Federal Way and Kent. Jonathan, these are little small cities. Okay, I'll keep you in conversation there, okay. And so with leaders like Denny and others on the state level, I don't just stop here in Seattle. That's my passion. I'm the Seattle's mayor. It's a very important position. But I also want to work collaboratively with state leaders and county leaders, because we're still one community. Last I checked, I drove to Renton today to go look at the Seahawks practice. I didn't see a big boundary between the two areas. And so this work, I can't be so insular and so I have to fight for this in Seattle because Seattle is one of the biggest problems. But I think I have to be collaborative enough to work with other organizations out. And I think I'm taking a little different approach through light rail, through job training. I'm going to do everything possible to keep Seattle affordable, but not to the detriment of other neighbors around us.
And we'll get into some of the policies that you're pursuing later. But I want to turn to Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck. You know, in researching for this panel, I discovered this report that you had co-authored back in 2018. I think it was called Missing Millions of Homes. And it had some core findings about what some of the root causes are of the shortage of homes. And there's kind of two parts to this problem. We've got a fundamental supply problem because we don't have enough homes, and that creates a lot of competition. It doesn't have to be there if we had more homes, but it creates a lot of competition for homes. And oftentimes people who, you know, Black families especially, lose out in that race, you know, because they have, you know, demographically systemic racism over, you know, generations has created some, you know, structural barriers. But in this report, when it comes to, you know, the supply of housing, you identified these factors. Zoning and land use regulations are slowing and restricting building of housing. 2, demand has shifted to walkable, transit-served urban areas, which are in short supply. 3, construction funding is less available in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And 4, construction labor is not getting more productive, and the labor pool is not increasing. And I'm wondering, you know, what you missed back then, what you wish you would have known back then that you know now.
Thank you, Joshua. Another way to express those 4 items is the 4 L's, some permutation of land, labor, lumber, and lending. And by lumber, of course, I mean supplies, and lending is financing available. Those are, if you want to understand the shortage of housing, you have to understand what the inputs are. Those are the only inputs. So something is not working right with one of those 4 inputs. So thanks to Representative Gregerson, an outstanding legislator, I might add, and a bunch of her colleagues in the legislature this last year, we had what has been universally characterized as the year of housing. More good legislation passed to help increase the supply of housing, especially affordable housing, than any session in history. And the reason that happened is the answer to your question, which is to say that an unbelievably diverse coalition of people came together and said, after all these years, whatever disagreements we may have out here, here's what we agree on. And we're all going to get harnessed up and lean into making these things happen. And this coalition included Habitat, by the way. Brian, wherever you are, thank you. In fact, for those of you who are involved in Habitat, thank you. You are literally doing God's work. I'm eternally grateful. But it was as diverse as big business and the BIAW and the realtors and the low-income housing people and Habitat and everybody in between. The Greens were at the table because they recognized that we need an increased supply. And one of the relief valves to a shortage of supply would be more sprawl, which is not environmentally benign. So all of these folks came together that have never agreed on anything before. They've never agreed on what day of the week it is.
Your time is over.
I get that a lot. So I guess I began to see a glimmer of it back in those days. I wish I would have more fully realized what would be possible then. We might have gotten here even a little bit quicker. The coalition that helped us make the year of housing, thanks to, again, outstanding leadership by people like Representative Gregerson, meets to strike again in January. More about that later.
Well, it was just a few years later that you wrote another paper which was called "The Racial Wealth Gap is the Housing Gap." And
You're darn right it is.
that seems like an evolution of your thinking about supply in a way.
Well, add on, I don't know about it, evolution. Look, you all know this data better than I do, and some of you have lived experience at it. It's obviously more relevant than mine. But we need to keep certain facts in mind if we really want to fully grasp the situation. These are facts. There's no passion or interpretation on my part. Here's the fact. The biggest asset of the average American is their home equity. That's the biggest asset. Number two, as a consequence of decades and generations of policies and practices that prevented people of color and Black folk especially from being able to purchase their homes, they were unable to. And as a consequence, in this state, the data is a little more than half the percentage of Black families own their homes as white families. Now, here's the coda to that. On a national level, the average net worth of a Black family is about 10% of a white family. Did you hear that correctly? 10%. The reason is they weren't allowed to buy homes.
Absolutely.
So when you buy a home, you build equity. Mom and dad bought one for $3,000. I'm not a youngster anymore, so it's been a while. I bought my first home, which was 3 bedrooms, 2 full baths for $17,000. So I was 21 years old. I was able to do that and start building home equity and trading up the ladder one rung at a time as a consequence of being able to get into my home. For generations, Black folks have not been able to do that. They've not been allowed to do that. And as a consequence, there was less intergenerational wealth transferred. This is not rocket science. This is as plain as the nose on our faces. And it's part of the reason, frankly, why the legislation, with the help of the people in this room, Black Home Initiative is here, Habitat was a part of this. Thank you, Nicole. You're on the board, are you not?
Yeah.
I love you.
Yeah.
We passed the Covenant Recording Act.
Mhm.
That is historic, not in Washington State. Oh my God, there he sits. I didn't see you come in, sir. One of the spark plugs behind that is somebody who's done more to increase housing, affordable housing in the state than any other individual in the history of the state. That's former Speaker Frank Chop.
Mhm.
Nobody is more responsible for increasing affordable housing than Frank. And Jamila Taylor, Representative Taylor, the prime sponsor of that, Frank, a trustee lieutenant on this, passed that bill. That is not historic in Washington State. That is historic in our country.
Absolutely.
That is unprecedented legislation. And that leads me to my concluding admonition for all of you. I just don't want your phone to go off on me again. For those of you who are involved in the Covenant homeownership issue, please receive this message as somebody who is your friend. We've got to get this right.
Mhm.
Yeah, we're studying it for a year, and then then we'll decide, and they'll decide how to move forward with it. Jonathan Reckford, I'd like to turn to you for a second. You know, Habitat is an international organization. I'm less familiar with its work internationally, but I find myself sometimes in conversations like these wanting a little bit of an international perspective, especially when it comes to this model we have in this country of, so much of how we build generational wealth, or how we pass things on to our children, is defined by what we can put in our homes. And so that's where the legacy of this of structural racism that prevents Black families and other racial minorities from owning homes, has such an impact. I'm wondering, is it different in other places? Have we strapped ourselves to a model that that we may not always see the negative consequences of, or are there other ways in other countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are different approaches. The only place that arguably can claim they've got it right is Singapore. And it's not really a replicable model. It's a controlled, semi-authoritarian, benevolent city-state that can control its borders and decide and tell everybody where to live. So they have created mixed faith, mixed race, and built enough housing for all their citizens. But they only let people in if they have housing. So it's really unique. And I would say, Western Europe used to claim they had it right. But there's a huge housing crisis in Western Europe now. And so I don't think there are, perfect models. I think there are principles, though, that have worked really well. And, I think you could debate home ownership versus, long-term rental. And there are debates about, Japan has a model that's interesting. Now they're the oldest population in world history. And so they've got a very different set of challenges. But they've always made it very easy to build, and they have always had sort of the idea that you're whether you own it or rent it, you're using housing as a product rather than as an investment. So housing, Tokyo is probably a shining example of going from complete destruction only 75 years ago to small shacks, to small houses, to small apartment buildings, to medium-sized apartment buildings, to high rises, and they've grown. It's one of the largest cities in the world without slums or informal settlements, and that's really unusual. And so I think thinking about housing as a service rather than housing as an investment is a legitimate conversation. But to echo Lieutenant Governor, there's no question, if you look at the wealth gap and if you look at social mobility, housing is such a big piece of that answer. And for many people, the only way they've been able to, essentially, it's the forced savings over time. I don't think, I think we actually have a problem today, which is people are looking for housing as an investment. And that created some bad behavior in cycles versus thinking of housing as long-term savings. And so I think the quick flips and the spinning and zero interest rates, arguably for too long, were probably negative influences in terms of affordability. Now we're in a messy correction. But fundamentally, I still think that the global issue is always still back to a supply issue. How do you build enough housing? And I was actually just doing a demographic study for another conference. Our first global advocacy effort was around property rights, because still women and marginalized groups all around the world don't have property rights. And that's such a fundamental first step to solving. But now our new campaign we're launching this summer called Home Equals is all about families living informally. And we've got 1 billion people living in informal settlements around the world. And that's projected to double in the next decade if we don't intervene. And that's because you can't stop rapid urbanization. Between human conflict and climate-driven conflict, that's exacerbating it. And so people are flooding into cities that don't have the infrastructure for their current population, let alone their future population. And there are some really creative solutions out there. And I think, Colombia has done some really interesting work where they didn't build the housing, but they formalized the informal settlements and then created transit connections to them. And then families, knowing they could stay, started investing in housing, and the market started actually solving housing, but the government solved the underlying infrastructure. And where it's generally gotten wrong, and it's really hard for fast-growing cities, is they don't have to build all the housing, but they've got to allocate the land and hold it when they're growing. So the big mistake, Seoul did it better than most cities. Seoul, when I lived there, it was 8 million people. Now it's 22 million people. That's really big growth. And they grew mostly without slums. Not perfect. There are plenty of challenges in every big city. But every time they expanded the transit out and grew the city, they grabbed 1/3 of the land where they were creating huge windfall for housing. So the housing grew with the city growing. And again, certainly not perfect, but better than many alternatives. So I think, it is very much an American thing to have the 30-year fixed mortgage. That's a unique aspect in our world. And that has created opportunity. And I think the problem is it hasn't been an equal opportunity. But I would say that, in some ways, the biggest opportunity is really thinking about land use first. And if you can solve some of those pieces, then you can start to solve a lot of the financing and other pieces.
Your experience in Colombia reminds me of when I was in architecture school, worked in a slum in Mexico outside of Cuernavaca, and they basically gave land ownership. The political establishment was looking for those voters and gave them the property rights to the land that they were squatting on. And it grew up into a community rather organically. It takes us to this model of, it takes us back to home ownership. And I'm wondering, Nicole, as we think through sort of, you're kind of on both sides of this, you think about home ownership a lot. I'm wondering, what's the right way to think about there's the supply issue, and then there's the limits of the market to be able to serve people. I'm wondering what's the right way to think about the balance between subsidized affordable housing and getting people into home ownership and market rate, and how do you see all those things coming together?
I don't think there is a right way because there is no monolith in the community. Everyone needs something different. So I think each model has a merit and is important for the community. I believe the habitat model is important. I believe a free market is important because there are opportunities that otherwise wouldn't be available. So how I think about it is really, what is the entry point of the folks who just really are coming to me and saying, this is what I want to be a homeowner. These are my challenges, but these are the things that I can do. And then what are those next steps? And so for me, that's how I think about it. There is no right way other than collaboration. I will say that. Now, more important than anything, there is no one organization that's going to get this done. Love Habitat, great organization, but Habitat can't get it done. And so it is important that we all think about this from a collaborative perspective, which is why I signed on to BHI immediately, because this is a fundamentally different way of approaching this. And we're doing it with multiple stakeholders at the table, as Lieutenant Heck so eloquently shared. And that is a different model. And I am, as you mentioned, the president for the RealTIS, which is the National Association of Real Estate Brokers. And we're a national organization, and they're talking about what we're doing here in Little Seattle. And so that is really an important thing to understand and discover. And in the work that I'm doing, that's how I'm really looking at this model. There is no right way other than the collaboration, and there is no one entry point. There are multiple. So how can we do this collaboratively and not make it about, really trying to make it competition, and really cutting each other's throats, to be quite frank. That's from a banking perspective. I'm a banker at heart. And bankers are cutthroat. Lenders are cutthroat. We know many of you, maybe some loan officers in here or know some, they are no joke. But they don't get to the heart of why the work is being done. It's really about housing people in this fundamental right to own a home and be able to do from the Black community what the white community has been able to do. Have kids say they don't have student debt. My children being able to say that. Being able to start a business, being able to have these assets that you're passing on from generation to generation and generation. That is, for me, what is the ultimate most important part of this work.
I'd like to turn to the mayor now and ask you a couple questions about policy. You can apply it if you want to. That was a good student. Mayor, I'd like to ask you about a couple of different, both from the supply side and then from subsidies, because your office has done some really interesting work with, connecting with groups and helping them find funding to support subsidized housing, groups that may not have sensed that they could be a part of that process before. But from the supply side, the city has a choice now that the state has passed this law requiring denser housing in neighborhoods that used to be dominated by single family homes. The city has a choice in sort of how aggressively to pursue that. Right? There's sort of a relief valve in the law that just passed that says you can just do 85% of your residential land can meet this standard, and you can sort of pick some areas and they don't have to meet that. And I'm wondering, the Puget Sound Regional Council has said, when they project how many houses we need and they project how many houses could come out of this middle housing bill that passed, it's about a fifth of the need, say. And so that kind of means that we need maybe 4 more big legislative changes kind of like that, or 4 more big initiatives. And so sometimes I'm wondering in terms of the scale, when Seattle's saying, should we kind of take the simple, 85% route, or should we go further? Are you prepared to meet the scale of the problem?
That's a great question. And therein sort of lies the complexity of the issue, that we are now, like it or not, one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing major city in the country. I asked a tough question, well, who's coming here? What are their demographics? What are their income levels? What kind of jobs must we prepare for when I read statistics like that? The challenge we have is this beast that we're all fighting collectively, sort of nameless and faceless. It's we are now living in a country where there are just extreme levels of wealth and extreme levels of poverty. The Seattle that Nicole and I lived in, my neighbors were food service workers and teachers and nurses. That middle class, that demographic, they are borderline homeless now, or they can't live in the city. So to answer your question directly, our housing strategy is almost touched on almost everything that we do, because we need as much density as possible. But I also have to realize that there are people moving here to fulfill our employers that may not live in a small area. And so we're trying to look at, I asked my cabinet, first thing I did was started a housing sub-cabinet. Everybody that touches housing under one roof. I had to do a lot of systems analysis in my administration. One reason why we're able to be so nimble is because from an organizational design and improvement standpoint, I looked at the breakdown in systems and how my departments communicated to each other. Complete failure in systems. So what I've asked them to do is, number one, look at all of the unused capacity that we still have in the city. We have right now one of the biggest transit projects, the biggest transit project in the country, $53.8 billion of light rail right now. We have, as we continue to look at transit-oriented development in other areas, complete untapped potential that we probably won't even be able to fill in my lifetime. So how can I streamline the process? You saw when I relaxed or eliminated the design review process for certain affordable housing. I proposed the largest housing levy in our history at $970 million. That we have the largest budget, $250 million in our housing, and I recruited Michael Winkler-Chin because I needed someone with the community credibility to say we will do everything possible. The supply needs are going to be high, and last I checked, we weren't saying stay out of Seattle. Some of this growth, I'm not taking credit for it, is organic growth because, like it or not, we became that city of innovation. You look at our industrial lands policy. Now, every mayor that I've known, I've worked with 5 mayors, they sort of kicked that can down the bucket. We passed an industrial lands policy because I realized that not everyone's going to write code for Microsoft. Not everyone's going to make a deep 6-figure, $250,000 salary. These jobs pay good at the maritime, at the port, and then in our industrial lands. So we passed that, and I said, we're first and foremost a port maritime city. You look at our apprenticeship programs. You look at our pre-K, looking at brain development. All this is intended to make sure that I keep, and I use racial terms. I'm biracial, so when you guys, the black-white conversation, I never knew where I was in that conversation. I look beyond the races, but I will tell you, when I talk about Black and brown communities and communities who speak English as a second language, I am trying to keep that demographic very alive and well and thriving in Seattle. I got dinged by conservative talk shows because I said I wanted officers to look like the communities they serve. Is that such a racist thing to say, by the way? Okay. So my housing policy goes beyond that. I think we get sometimes stuck on the brick and mortar. Can you slice this plot of land up 10 times to get people in there? Well, hell, I may slice it up 10 times in the demographics I want in the city to make us truly diverse and just. May not even be able to get the 10 people in there because I got people moving from all over. So my housing policy permeates and everything else. When I get to these supply questions, I say, there's enough capacity out there to continue to build and build and build, and we'll continue to do that, and the state are giving us some great tools, we'll take advantage of them. But I also have to look at all of the parts of the ecosystem, not just the brick and mortar issues, and that's the mayor that I want to be.
Yeah, I mean, capacity is not the same as, I think you're stating this yourself, it's not the same as getting stuff built. But I mean, let's go to the subsidy idea and how I'd like you to highlight a couple of examples of, communities that you're helping to connect with resources in ways that maybe haven't happened in the past.
I'm sorry, I was thinking.
You were
I was
thinking.
in La La Land. I thought you were looking at Jonathan.
No, I was
So I
looking
was completely spaced out.
Yeah.
You weren't looking at Denny. I thought you just hit me again with a question.
I knew you were looking at Bruce.
And many of you know, I have, I think, a pretty wild sense of humor. It keeps me happy in this job that I sign up for. I actually was thinking about something. There, Apex is in town right now. It's the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation here, and I had to give a speech this morning, and I said I think a pretty good speech. And I was right there when your question. So hit me with a question again. I'm paying attention.
Here's what I'm thinking.
I wasn't present, as I would tell my wife. Sorry, honey, I wasn't present.
That's okay. That's
Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Ethiopian community of Seattle, for
Yes.
example. There's groups like this that that you are helping connect with funds that may not have had a voice in that before. You're
Yes.
trying to look at things with a racial equity lens in order to connect some of the resources with the communities most in need. And I'm wondering what is different about the way that you've been thinking about subsidy in the past, or the way that other administrations have thought about subsidy in the past.
Reckford, I think what is different is now, first and foremost, in our housing discussions, is the notion of climate change. That we look at parts of town that do not have tree canopy. We look at Duwamish, where they suffer from a king tide, and you saw who was displaced. You look at the health outcomes at South Park, realizing they're lower. So we're not only talking about housing, and so we have to have the communities impacted at the table, working with us to shape the package. And the beauty is groups like Habitat, and my notes had a few that I'm going to give a few shout outs here. The Homestead Community and Land Trust, Homesite, just other groups. I shouldn't do that, but I have to, because I watch them bring in people from impacted communities at the table, and then they rise to leadership positions. They are at the table, and they are, quite frankly, forcing political leaders to recognize them as the power that they are. So I think what's different, and sometimes I just have to get out the way, quite frankly. I have to give them resources and let them lead the way. When I look at the Black Home Initiative, that is powerful work. I didn't think of that. When you think about just helping someone out with a repair in their house or a delinquent tax bill, I didn't think of the grassroots stuff. So I think what's occurring now is that in our new lens of fighting racism, we realize we don't have to be saviors. We have to be compassionate leaders and allow others to lead as well. I'm seeing partnerships, quite frankly, that I've never seen before. And I'm an old fart. I've been around, but I'm seeing partnerships in communities in an unprecedented level. And it's a beautiful thing to see.
I'd like to now, in terms of the time, we're going to go a little bit later because we started a little bit later, maybe to 6:15. Sound good? Or so. I want to get a sense of what we might be missing in this conversation. I'd like to start with you, Nicole. What are we missing?
I think from that perspective is really understanding that when we talk about the Black Home Initiative, when we talk about the issues with the Black wealth gap, let's be very clear. We're talking about descendants of the enslaved Africans. That's a very different experience than an African immigrant or someone else who may identify as Black, Afro-Latina. And it's a very different experience with very different historical contexts that we have to keep at the forefront, and that I continue to keep at the forefront. Because folks who know me know that what drives me crazy more than anything is when we start having this Black conversation, the whatabouts come. Well, what about this community? What about that community? What about that community? Everyone has a need. But the reality is, in this country, descendants of the enslaved Africans have the most need and have been pushed out the most, have been affected the most from all of these racist policies and practices and systems that were put in place to ensure that people who look like me could not be a true citizen for what the Constitution calls for, because we weren't thought about when the Constitution was written. And so it's important that we keep that in the forefront of these conversations, that we and understand that a rising tide raises all boats. If we solve the problem for the Black community, it is solved for all the communities. The civil rights era is a perfect example of that. You know, along with allies, and I don't like even the word allies, accomplices. So people who are willing to get in the mud with us, not just sit over there and say, hey, we support you, Black Lives Matter, but who are actually in the streets with us. You know, the Black community was leading that charge, but women got things out of the civil rights movement. Immigration boomed from the civil rights movement. So we know when we are focusing on the least of these, everyone is going to be able to grow and thrive. So I want to make sure that that stays at the forefront of these conversations that we're having, that we need to be clear on the communities that we're talking about and not be afraid to use that language, which, you know, historically in 5 or 10 years ago, I would have been put out this room for saying that, to be quite frank, in Seattle. So, you know, being clear about the history and then understand where we're going with that.
So we're talking about the history. We've got the covenant homeownership, you know, law that passed. What's the next most important thing that you're going to be looking for in terms of the law and changes?
Well, you know, like Lieutenant Heck said, getting that right first and foremost, because we know people are going to come for it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, somebody's going to try to tear it down. So we want to make sure it's bulletproof.
It's going to end up in court. Yeah.
We all know that. And so making sure that we can stave off that kind of attack, I think, is the most important thing, because it's a model for the rest of the country. I am getting calls saying, how did you do that? We want to do that in our state. We want to do that in this our part of the country. And so I think we get too many things in front of us. And for me, it's just, I am very focused on 2-3 key things and getting those done. And that CHA is one of those main things for me, because I sit on the commission. Just recently became the board chair. And so we are managing that work. So I want to make sure we get that right so that we can continue these policy wins and continue to move the needle in a real way that's constructive for the community. And so those are the things that I think are most important that I'm focusing on in this work. And then as a lender, ensuring that we're showing up in real time with real product and services and real access, and not just talking about it, but doing it, so that communities can say, hey, you know, Umpqua Bank I feel comfortable going there. I got my mortgage there. I didn't have to jump through a bunch of hoops and be told no, and, you know, having lenders toe the line, because there's a lot of lenders, a lot of bankers and financial institutions who talked about it, you know, when it was a thing to do. But now that we're getting further away from George Floyd's murder, you know, now folks are kind of backing away from those promises that they made. And so holding people, their feet to the fire, is one of the other 2 things that are important for me.
Jonathan, I'd like to turn to you. You've got a broad perspective on these issues that transcends any individual city and even internationally. What do you think we're missing in this conversation?
You know, I think it's been implied and somewhat stated, but the reason I said land use before is fundamentally we've got to look at zoning, because to get there, we need a lot of financing, and what you've done in the city and the state is a huge step forward, and you're way ahead of many places. But if you look at good intentions aren't enough. And I was talking earlier today about, you know, California, super liberal, most broken housing market in the country, and because they've made it impossible to build. And so it is, you know, it's not funny. Instead of NIMBY, they have banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And so anybody can stop a housing development and tie it up for 5 years. And that's a huge tax, right? So making it easier to build, but it's also where you build. And I would strongly recommend, if people haven't read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, lays out brutally just the facts and the history. And the problem is, you know, all over the country, there were in the deeds restrictive covenants saying you can't sell this house to a Black person or a Jew. And then with fair housing, those got replaced by everyone's welcome as long as you can have a 1-acre lot with a 3-car garage and all these other pieces, which essentially economically replaced racial covenant. And 75-80% of most of our cities are zoned single family only. And you can't make the math work if it's all single family zoning. So we need more density in the right places. But I think we know the best societal outcome for everybody is mixed income, mixed use. It's best for the environment, it's best from an equity perspective, it's best actually for the economy. But it's not the way we've organized and zoned. And so we need to actually lower the barriers in communities of high opportunity that have restrictive zoning. And then we need to reinvest, maybe less in Seattle, but most cities have an area where all the affordable housing got concentrated, but underinvested with fewer services, less access. And I believe we need to do both sides. We need to make those more mixed income by investing, but simultaneously lower the barriers in the other areas, because otherwise you'll fight displacement, because investment means people don't have anywhere to go or have to get pushed way out. And so we're seeing essentially the equivalent of informal settlements is homelessness, which is really the tip of the iceberg. It's the visible piece of a much broader swath of people who are traveling long distances, overcrowded, or paying unreasonable percentages of their income, their cost burden. And so there are no magic bullets, there are no easy answers. It's going to take, but I think cities have land, and they have the fastest way is they can allocate the land they have, but make it available for housing, and then putting density in the right places. I think it gets confused in terms of saying, oh, they're going to put high-rise buildings in all our single-family neighborhoods. There's a whole range, and we've seen cities do really well. It was interesting, small city example, but just yesterday's Wall Street Journal had an example about New Rochelle, New York, a historically underhoused area. They did a comprehensive multi-year plan and approved all the zoning at once. And so essentially, and opened all it. So once it was approved as a master plan, nobody could undo any of it. So they built a ton of housing along transit in density in the core in a very short period of time. But they probably did some stuff that made everybody upset, and some stuff that made everybody a little bit happy, because they sped up that process dramatically.
Mayor Harrell, does that sound like a good idea?
It sounds like phenomenal. I love what I'm hearing. This has been a very rich conversation, Jonathan. Thank you. What's missing for me as a mayor is, number one, we have, I think, one of the best. Remember on the federal side of things that we had under the one who should not be named, who now just had another 17 indictments. We had Ben Carson as the head of housing, who was just awful. We have now Marcia Fudge, and I've developed a really good relationship with Marcia Fudge, who came as a small mayor from a small city. And if we are serious about this issue, and she's an African-American woman, for those that know her background, if we are serious about this issue, and we are, then that federal piece with vast resources that I have many discussions, and we're making great headways on having them be a strong partner. This is beyond sometimes a state budget. We are talking about generational issues, as the Lieutenant Governor said. In the discussion of reparations, that sometimes is off-putting. I describe to people that my mother received a $20,000 check reparations. My mom and dad fought about who would get it. And then my father was black. He wasn't in the intern camps, but he didn't get any, by the way. But what I talk about is, okay, that may be a debate that's going to go on for decades, but on this housing piece, I need the federal government. So I'm working as your mayor, hard on these relationships. We've made incredible progress. But if I'm looking at the component, we're fixing this on a state and local and a levy basis with all of your great work, and I need them to help me step up a little more. What's also missing, number two, is it's a shame here in Seattle, and I said this quote unquote to both President Biden, Vice President Harris, Marcia Fudge, all of them. I said, if we can't figure this out in Seattle, our country is in a world of hurt. Why is that? Because we have Microsoft, we have Amazon, we have Starbucks, we have Warehouse, we have Boeing, we have Alaska Airlines. I know them all. And they don't tell me what to do. I tell them what I need. And what's missing, Microsoft stepped up and they did this loan program about north of $750 million. Seattle was not a big recipient of that. And so I've told billionaires this, that if you're worth 150 billion, you have a moral obligation to look at the damage that you've caused when money is a finite resource. So what's missing is the kind of partnership that I'm committing to you to develop with these large companies. In Seattle, we are a wealthy city. Why do I have people in tents that can't afford to live in a house? So that piece is missing. The last piece for me is that I don't blame other people for problems. I never have. I it just didn't get very far in my life. There are also African Americans and people of color that have come here that have pretty significant levels of wealth. I'll say it. I meet with a lot of them. And I also believe that if we're going to demonstrate that our Black community matters, and we're trying to preserve that kind of richness, let's be the leaders we can be. That's conversations a lot of you wouldn't be part of. It's conversations that my wife and I had. My wife retired after 20 years at Microsoft. And I believe that I was a beneficiary of affirmative action. I was. You know, I was the, you know, some of you are my vintage. We were alive when JFK was killed and Martin Luther King was killed. I saw laws passed that allowed me to go to great schools. A lot of that's dried up now. So I have an obligation to do everything I can do possibly for people that look like me, to make sure that we harness our resources as well. We will lead. And if we lead the right way, then we will get the Bezos of the world to recognize that we mean what we say and say what we mean. So that's what's missing for me. And that's what I signed up for when I became mayor.
Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck, wondering, you know, you've got the perspective of, you've worked at the federal level, you've worked at the state level. What is missing for you? I mean, what are we not understanding about the scale of this problem or what needs to be done next?
Where to begin? Well, again, God has not repealed the law of supply and demand. And demand significantly outstrips supply. And that inevitably causes costs to go up to purchase a home. Indeed, often what we miss is if market rate housing supply isn't adequate, it drives rents up because people have to stay renting because they can't afford to buy a home. They stay renting, occupancies go up, rents go up. And if rents go up enough, also as the State Department of Commerce concluded, the #1 reason for homelessness in this state is unaffordable rents. So the dimension to this was embedded in your question, Joshua. The magnitude of this problem is very large. We're not treading water at trying to bring supply back in demand. We're actually going backwards. The State Department of Commerce has projected we're going to need approximately 1 million new housing units in the next 20 some years. And we're nowhere near on a pace to meet that demand.
You just have bad luck when you talk.
I just talk too much. So the magnitude of the problem is beyond what I think most of us grasp. And one of the things that implies get to something that the mayor said, which is this is going to take something. I'm going to use a phrase I don't like to use because I think politicians use it as a cop-out when they use it. It's going to take an all of the above approach. Now, politicians often say that because they don't want to give a firm answer and that's an easy way out. But I don't think that's the case in housing. It's going to take all of the above. It's going to take local government and state government, and yes, increasingly federal government. And it's also going to take the private sector. The public sector cannot appropriate enough, tax enough to appropriate enough to build our way out of this unless we figure out a way to collaborate and do it in partnership with the private sector. Now, the biggest need and supply is clearly affordable housing. And that means that people with less income are the ones that get hurt the worst. But we should understand that housing lies at the intersection of a lot of issues. An inadequate supply reduces retirement income and security. Why is that? You may have read in the Seattle Times yesterday that in 1981, the average age of a first-time home buyer was 29. Today, it's 36.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that if you defer purchasing an asset that grows over time, you're going to have less asset at the end of your journey. Reduces retirement security. Lack of supply harms the environment because people have to move farther and farther away from work. That means they commute longer distance. Tailpipe solution. Stormwater runoff off the impermeable surfaces of the roads in which they drive. It certainly increases racial disparity. We've talked about that here today. It lowers standards of living because as rents go up, people are making real trade-offs between things that they need in their lives and just making the rent payment. Housing lies at the intersection of a lot of our problems. And so I just want to conclude with where I began, which is, first of all, to say thank you to everybody in this room who was a part of getting so much done in the last session. Thank you. Two, as I like to say, without implementation, there is no policy. So we were the snake, we swallowed a dog. We got to digest it now. We have to do this right. I especially feel strongly about the covenant bill in that regard because it's so groundbreaking. And because they're coming after us, right, Nicole? We have to do this right. And thirdly, that magnificent, beautiful coalition that managed to put a lot of its differences aside. The differences remain. Indeed, my biggest worry is that as we enter the January session, since we did so much before, the differences that we agreed to disagree on are going to become more center stage. And that cannot happen because we still have so much more to do. In addition to implementation, you talked about transit. There was a transit-oriented development bill that did not pass, one of the few kind of major pieces that did not pass. There's lot splitting, more available land. There's rural ADUs. I could go on and on and on. Things that generally the coalition agreed on that we didn't get there on. We've got to stay focused on the parts of the Venn diagram where we overlap. Because if we allow our debates, our disagreements, and I'm going to be very direct with you, if we allow our disagreements about some form of rent control on the one hand, or on the other hand, blowing up the Growth Management Act so we have more land available, if we allow those disagreements to take center stage, all the other stuff that we could get done, we won't get done. So I'm actually pleading with you, for those of you who are involved in this, don't let our disagreements set aside our collaborative effort to continue to make progress on this, because the magnitude of the problem is very, very significant, and its issues permeate our society.
All right, I think on that note, it's time for us to close. I've got this.
That's not my close.
That was a heck of a close. That was a great close.
I want to give you a chance just to say one line, one sentence, if you can. The single most important point you would make about housing the coming year. This is a lightning round for you each to make just one final point. But I'm going to ask you to keep it to a sentence because we're out of time. All right, Nicole, we'll start with you real quick.
What a challenge. Let's get it right.
All right.
Jonathan, make it faster and easier to build.
Harrell.
Remember, there's strength in our love for what we're trying to do that will be the most sustainable power to do this kind of work together.
Lieutenant Governor Huff.
Wait for the phone to ring.
Pillow, blanket, roof. If you don't have a pillow to lay your head on at night, a blanket to keep yourself warm, and a roof over your head to keep the rain off, then any other issue in your life will not be able to be successfully dealt with, because you do not successfully deal with those if you're living under a bridge or couch surfing or in a tent.
All right. Thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. I've been asked to remind everyone that there is a reception after this, and that if you'd like to gather with some of the people here and discuss this further, the way to find that reception is you go out these doors and you're supposed to follow the flowers and they will take you to the reception. So
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you all so much for coming.